Good morning. This is the Mack Church of Christ Sunday Samuel, the Chronicle study. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 1, what we're covering today. Let me kind of give you an overview of Samuel by taking a look at this chart by Jensen's. And if you look at the chart, we're here where it says Samuel, and if you notice here, he's going to be the main individual for the first 9 chapters. Then after that, we'll have Saul, but we're in this section here. We also have Eli, who's the priest during this time. We just finished studying in chapter 1, the birth of Samuel, and we're going to now take a look at the call of Samuel in the first 4 chapters. And notice that Samuel is a prophet, and that during this time they had no king up to this time. And so just remember that as we get into this and take a look at it. We're glad you're here and pray the Lord blesses you with everything that you need. We're looking at, if you notice here on my, if you take a look and notice here on my e-sword, notice that we're looking at the 1 Samuel chapter 2. Go up here to 1 Samuel chapter 1. You notice that we have the birth of Samuel, which is what we talked about. Remember that the birth of Samuel was due to the fact that Elkanah had 2 wives. One was named Hannah, and one was named Peninnah, and Peninnah had children, and Hannah didn't. But Elkanah loved Hannah more than he loved Peninnah, so there was always that rivalry between the two, which always happens in the Bible, where you have individuals who are polygamous or have more than one wife. And it seems God allowed that during that time, but nonetheless, there's always problems whenever you have two women married to one man in the Old Testament, and even today in shows like I don't know if you've ever seen that show called Sister Wives, but I happened to glance at it one time, and there's nothing but drama with the women who are supposedly married to this one guy, but that's the way it is. When you leave God's word, it creates problems. But anyway, Elkanah loved Hannah, but as I mentioned, Peninnah had children, and so therefore she was kind of favored. And whenever they would go to the temple yearly, Hannah would be ridiculed and mocked by Peninnah. And so she prayed to the Lord, and when she prayed to the Lord, God allowed her to have a son, and that son was named Samuel, and she kept him until he was weaned. And there's a number of reasons for that, and probably one of them, the main ones, is because you don't want to give a little baby to a priest and expect the priest to be able to take care of the baby. If you offer something to the priest, you want to make it something that's going to be beneficial for the priest. And so she waited at least until he was weaned. In their case, it could be, in their culture, it could be anywhere from 3 to 6 years old. I'm thinking more like around 5 or 6, where the child would be able to minister, because that's what we see him doing. Now, Hannah had just gone in chapter 2 and presented Samuel to the priest and told Eli that Samuel was going to be given to him and given to the Lord, and that he was going to serve in the house of the Lord there forever. Of course, remember, that's the tabernacle that's under consideration. And so as a result of that, Hannah, if you remember in the last part of chapter 1, when she took Samuel to present him, she also took with her a bull to slaughter, in other words, to sacrifice, as she presented the child to Eli. And so verse 28 says of 1 Samuel 1, "So I have also dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to the Lord." And he worshiped the Lord there. And so in chapter 2, we're continuing this. And what we have in chapter 2 is, as it says here, Hannah's prayer. And this prayer certainly reminds us of the prayer that was prayed by Mary when the Lord appeared to her and asked her to be the vessel for the Son of God. And there's many similarities to the two. And if you want to compare those, that would definitely be a good study. The other thing to notice is, even though this text that I'm using here doesn't show it, this prayer was written in poetry. At least it was recorded in poetry. And so that kind of says a couple of things. Number one, it says that either Hannah had actually written this prayer out in poetry, or had at least rehearsed it a number of times in her mind as a poem, because remember, she had at least 3 to 5 years to prepare for the giving of her son to Eli and to the Lord. And so that's interesting. We have a brother here who likes to write out his prayers, and they seem very poetical. And sometimes when he reads them, I kind of felt uneasy at first because they were so poetic, until I looked at this and recognized that here's a prayer that's recorded and it's poetic. And so therefore, there's actually nothing wrong with that. But we need to make sure that our poems or our prayers that we write down aren't being written down just to make an impression on people, but because they're the desires of our heart. Remember, that's what prayers are about. And so anyway, just want to point that out. And so let me just read this for you and notice what she says. Then it says, verse 1, then Hannah prayed and said, now this is after she offered the bull and after she sacrificed and then offered Samuel to Eli. It says, my heart exalts in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. There is no one holy like the Lord. Indeed, there is no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. Boast no more so very proudly. Do not let arrogance come out of your mouth, for the Lord is a God of knowledge, and with him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty are shattered, but the feeble gird on strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for bread, but those who were hungry cease to hunger. Even the barren gives birth to 7, but she who has many children languishes. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and rises up. The Lord makes poor and rich. He brings low. He also exalts. He raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with nobles and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillar of the earth are the Lord's, and he set the world on them. He keeps the feet of his godly ones, but the wicked one are silenced in darkness. For not by might shall a man prevail. Those who contend with the Lord will be shattered. Against them he will thunder in the heavens. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king and will exalt the horn of his anointed. Then Elkanah went to his home at Ramah, but the boy ministered to the Lord before Eli the priest. And so as you read this prayer that she prays, it's really interesting. First of all, realize that the name Hannah here, actually down here, if you notice in Brown and Driver's Briggs, or Briggs and Brown, you notice that the word means grace. It means favored. And it's kind of interesting that it didn't seem like she was favored when Peninnah was always ridiculing her because she had no children, but she was favored. She was favored by her husband, and she was also favored by the Lord in this case, because the Lord heard her. Now, as the Lord hears her, I want you to notice her response and her reaction. And I want to ask you if we would respond the same way when God does stuff for us. It says, my heart exalts in the Lord, and my horn is exalted in the Lord. My mouth speaks boldly against my enemies, because I rejoice in your salvation. So remember that this word salvation means deliverance. It doesn't necessarily always mean salvation as in the standpoint of saving us from eternal sin or from eternal death, but certainly that's the way the word is used. In this context, the salvation or the deliverance was from the ridicule of Peninnah that was always against Hannah, or was used against Hannah. So God is delivering her from that. And what I want you to notice is she says that she exalts in the Lord. And so she's trusting the Lord, and the horn represents the power of the Lord. And so her power is in the Lord, and therefore her mouth can speak boldly against her enemies, which in this case would be Peninnah. And that is because she rejoices in God's deliverance. So remember that it's God who delivered her. God could have chosen not to open her womb, but God in fact did. And therefore, she rejoices in his deliverance. Verse 2 says that there is no one holy like the Lord. That's why in the Lord's Prayer, we're supposed to pray, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, because there's nobody like him. Indeed, there is no one besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. Now, in the Old Testament, the rock was always used to represent God. I think there's only one case that I can remember off the top of my head where the word rock was used to speak of somebody else, but it was used to speak of Abraham and being a chip off the old block, as we call it. But every other place that the word rock is used as a figurative reference to security, it always refers to God. And the reason I point that out is because some people like to think that Peter is the rock that Jesus was talking about in Matthew chapter 18, when Jesus is asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And the disciples said, "You're the Christ," or Peter said, "You're the Christ." And Jesus says, and you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. He wasn't talking about Peter being the rock. Peter is a little a boulder. The rock here is a cliff or a mountainside where you can build a dwelling. And so God is always the rock, and it's used that way in the Old Testament. And so people who want to make Peter the rock take that rock out of biblical context, and they don't understand it properly. But he's the rock. He's the one that we depend on and believe in. And so she's depending on him. Verse 3 says, "Boast no more so very proudly, but do not let arrogance come out of your mouth." And in other words, she's kind of looking at Peninnah and telling Peninnah that Peninnah acted proudly and was arrogant because she had children and Hannah didn't. And this is something that we all need to remember. Many times people think that the abilities they have or the blessings they have somehow are their own efforts, even though they might have had to exercise them, they might have had to train them, they might have had to use them. What we need to remember is that everything we have comes from God. And therefore, for us to be arrogant about it, or for us to act like we're so wonderful because we have it, we really need to be careful about that, because that's what he's talking about here. Peninnah was bragging about the fact that she had children and Hannah didn't, and so she would make big light of it. But we're going to notice that circumstances are going to change. That also reminds me of sports today that we have in our culture, where the individual who makes a touchdown goes in the back and does his little celebration and spikes the ball as if he did something great, and it was just through his own effort or through his own ability. I personally don't mind the idea of competition, but I certainly believe that we need to understand that everything we have in our ability to even play sports well was given to us by God, and he's the one who should get the credit, and not us as we dance on the infield. But that's the way our culture is. Our culture looks at our efforts instead of God's. But I just wanted to point that out to you. So Peninnah was pointing out her own idea of what God did for her, and she was using it to be arrogant and to be very proud. And then it says, "For the Lord is the God of knowledge, and with him actions are weighed." In other words, God knows how people's attitudes are, and he's going to determine, he's going to weigh them. Now remember, Jesus always said that those who exalt themselves are going to be abased, but those who abase themselves are going to be exalted. And so that's what we see in this case here. God always helps the underdog. We like rooting for the champions, or we have a championship team. And even when we sometimes root for the underdogs, we only root for them because we want them to be champions and not because they're underdogs. But God actually is for the people who are not exalted, and people who are not proud, but the people who are abased. And so she says in verse 4, the bow of the mighty are shattered, but the feeble gird on strength. So Peninnah, who was mighty, now her bow has been shattered. In other words, she can't go around saying, I'm better than Hannah because Hannah doesn't have any children, because now Hannah has children and she can't boast about it. But the feeble gird on strength. The feeble would be Hannah, as Hannah has received strength from the Lord and the ability to bear children. Verse 5 says, those who were full hire themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry cease to be hungry. And so she's just pointing out what God does. God takes the exalted and brings them low, but he takes the low and exalts them. And so that's the example you have here. Person who is full ends up having to go out and get his own bread or find bread, but the person who was hungry is being fed by the Lord. And that's what's happening with Hannah and Peninnah. It says, even the barren gives birth to 7. Now, though Hannah had other children, she didn't have 7, but the number 7 in the scriptures is always the idea of complete or perfect. So God gives the barren what is perfect for them to have. And in this case, that would be Samuel. Samuel was perfect for being able to thwart Peninnah's ridicule of Hannah. And so God gave her what she needed in order to be able to be victorious over her enemy. It says, but she who has many children languishes. And so that, of course, that would be a reference to Peninnah, as now she can't brag about the fact that she's the only wife of Elkanah, who bore children. And so therefore she should be more respected and more loved than Hannah. And so now she's languishing because now Hannah has children. And not only does she have children, but she's the one favored by Elkanah. And so remember that anytime you have a plurality of women married to one man, you're going to have trouble. And so that's also what you see going on here. Now, verse 6 says, the Lord kills and the Lord makes alive. He brings down to Sheol and he raises up. In other words, what she's saying is that the Lord is the one who's going to make alive or bless, and the Lord is the one who's going to condemn people. That's what John was saying when he pointed out that he's not the one who can bless you with the Spirit, but that one was going to come who would bless you with fire and the Spirit. The fire represented killing or destruction or judgment, and the Spirit represented making you alive or eternal life or being blessed. And so God's the one who does that. And that's what we need to remember. It says he brings down to Sheol and raises up. In other words, Sheol here would be the grave. In other words, he allows people to die and he allows people to be raised up. The Lord's the one who does it. Again, in verse 7, the Lord makes poor and rich. He brings low and he also exalts. So she's giving credit to the fact that God is the one who does everything, and she's going to trust him no matter what happens. And in this case, she was favored because that's her name. And she was favored in these events, and therefore she's exalting the Lord in that. Verse 8 says, he raises the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with nobles. In other words, where she had been ridiculed by Peninnah, now she's sitting like a queen, as Peninnah recognizes that Hannah not only is loved by Elkanah, but also has borne him children and inherit a seat of honor. So she's been raised up. Hannah's been raised up. She no longer has to hang her head because she's barren. He says, for the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he set the world on them. In other words, what she's saying is that God is the one who controls the world. If he can control the world, then he can control anything that happens in our life. And so if he wants to exalt us, he can exalt us. And we need to let him do the exalting, and we need to be pleased with whether he exalts or whether he makes us poor. We need to be pleased with him, but it's certainly wonderful when he chooses to be gracious to us and to answer the prayers that we request of him. Verse 9, it says, he keeps the feet of the godly ones, of his godly ones, but the wicked ones are silenced in darkness. And so here in this context, you would have the godly would be Hannah, who was being ridiculed and persecuted by Peninnah, who would be considered the wicked one. Now the wicked one has been put to silence and sits in darkness, while Hannah is exalted. And so this is just as much a prayer about the fact that God vindicates those who come to him and those who depend on him when they need to be vindicated, and to bring low those who are proud. And so it's certainly a lesson for us to remember. And one of the things that's interesting is that as we continue with this chapter, we're going to read about some individuals who were exalted that God is going to bring low. And the reason he's going to bring them low is because they don't depend on him. And so that's a main theme, you might say, in the scriptures. He says, for not by might shall a man prevail. In other words, it's not by our power that we can do the things that we do. Verse 10, he says, those who contend with the Lord will be shattered. Now, when Peninnah was ridiculing Hannah, that was certainly going against the Lord. That was something the Lord didn't want us to do. Today we have a big thing today with bullies and trying to get rid of bullying in our culture, you might say. The problem is that sometimes we see everything as being bullied instead of things that we need to deal with. But nonetheless, God doesn't like people who bully other people, and God doesn't like individuals who are ridiculing or making fun of other people just because of the abilities which God gave them that the other people might not possess as well, although they might possess other qualities. And so that's one of the things that we notice here. And it says, against them he will thunder in the heavens. In other words, God fights against them. And the Lord will judge the ends of the earth. And he will give strength to his king and will exalt the horn of his anointed. Now, it's interesting that she points out that he will give strength to his king, because Israel had no king. They never have had a king. But yet she's praying about the idea of having a king. And she's including this idea of a king. And so maybe, just maybe, if we go back over here to 1 Samuel, when she had her child, over here, it says, right here in 1 Samuel chapter 1, when it says that Elkanah was going to go pay his vows after the Lord had blessed Hannah with a child. And you notice what it says. It says, then the man Eli went up with all his household to offer the Lord the yearly sacrifice and to pay his vows, as he usually did. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, I will not go up until the child is weaned. Then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord and stay there forever. And Elkanah, notice what he says. Elkanah, her husband, said to him, do what seems best to you. Remain until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord confirm his word. So it could be that this word that was confirmed was more than just the birth of Samuel, but also included the idea of the coming of a king. And certainly we understand that king who's going to come in the very end, or the real king, is going to be Jesus. And so it could be that this is a reference to Jesus. I wouldn't put it past God to have inspired this prayer and had put in the heart of Hannah the idea that God was going to bring about a king, and that Samuel was going to be involved in that process in a small way, or at least help in that process. And it says, and he will give strength to his king and will exalt the horn of his anointed. So God is going to strengthen the king. Now then, verse 11. Then Elkanah went to his home at Ramah, but the boy ministered to the Lord before the priest. And so again, you see that Samuel, being an obedient child, was going to stay there at somebody else's house and basically become their adopted son and serve them and help in serving the Lord. And so that's certainly a far cry today from how some people think children ought to act. But just pointing that out. Now, verse 12, it says, now the sons of Eli were worthless men. They did not know the Lord. And the custom of the priests with the people, when any man was offering a sacrifice, the priest's servants would come while the meat was boiling with a three-pronged fork in his hand. Then he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. Thus they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. Also, before they burned the fat, the priest servants would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, give the priest meat for roasting, as he will not take boiled meat from you, only raw. If the man said to him, they must surely burn the fat first, and then take as much as you desire, then he would say, no, but you shall give it to me now, and if not, I will take it by force. Thus the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for the men despised the offering of the Lord. Now Samuel was ministering before the Lord as a boy wearing a linen ephod. And his mother would make him a little robe and bring it to him from year to year when she would come up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifices. Then Eli would bless Elkanah, his wife, and say, may the Lord give you children from this woman in place of the one she dedicated to the Lord. And they went to their own home, and the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. And the boy Samuel grew before the Lord. So in this section here, what we basically have this contrast between Samuel, who was, of course, Elkanah's son, and Eli's sons. And we notice maybe the reason why we have this story in here to help us understand, again, how God exalts the individuals who are low, and how he brings down the individuals who are, and how he brings down the individuals who are exalted. And so that's what we're going to see here. So it says, now the sons of Eli were worthless men, and they did not know the Lord. So they were priests, and Eli was a priest. And so his sons then would be ministering as priests as well. So Eli was the high priest, and his household would be the household that worked in the temple. And so they had a very, very important and special task in a special position. And yet it says they did not know the Lord. And that idea of not knowing the Lord is the idea of not understanding who the Lord is, or what the Lord is about, or what the Lord would want them to do. Okay, in John 8 and verse 55, it says, and you have come to know him, but I know him. Or I'm sorry, and you have not come to know him, but I know him. And if I say I do not know him, I will be a liar like you, but I know him and keep his word. And so Jesus knows who God is, and therefore he keeps his word. In John 16 and verse 3, he says, these things they will do because they have not known the Father or me. And so as we notice the things that Eli's sons are doing, they're doing them because they do not know the Lord. The idea of knowing the Lord is the idea of knowing, of having a relationship with God. In John chapter 17 and verse 3, it says, this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, in Jesus Christ, whom you have sent. If you remember back over here, this word know that's being used is kind of like the word over here in Matthew chapter 1, when it says down here about Joseph and Mary. It says in verse 24, and Joseph awoke from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord had commanded him, and took Mary his wife, but kept her virgin until she gave birth to a son, and he called his name Jesus. Now, the idea of that is the idea that he didn't know her until finally he had a relationship with her, and that's the way this word is being used here. The idea of having a relationship with God. And so, even though Eli's sons were doing, quote, kind of the work in the temple, they did not know the Lord. And that's a contrast with Samuel, who does know the Lord. And so you don't have to be raised by a preacher. You don't have to be raised by a priest in order to know the Lord. You can know the Lord by having good parents who teach you to follow Jesus or God, and to make sure that he's a part of your life, that God is actually involved in the things that are going on. And you don't just go about your life without any recognition of God, or that there is a God, or that he's around. That's the way you know somebody. I know my wife, and so therefore there's things I don't do and things I do because I know her, and I know how she would react to certain things. And so therefore, because I know her, it changes how I act. And that's what Elkanah's sons didn't understand. They didn't know the Lord. So when the scriptures talk about knowing the Lord, it's not talking about necessarily knowing the law. It's talking about knowing the Lord. That's why in Hosea chapter 4, where he's talking about the priests, he says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I also will reject you from being my priests. Since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. And so he points out that God is going to destroy Israel because of lack of knowledge. And you might think that he's talking about a lack of the law, and certainly it is. But the law is supposed to help you see God. That's what the law is for. It's to help you learn how to love God and how to love people. So the fact that they don't know the law isn't the primary issue. The primary issue is their relationship with God, which the law should help them to see and understand. And because they don't know the law, therefore they don't know God. But the point is they don't know God. Also in Malachi chapter 2, he points out that they don't know God either. The priests don't. He says, and now this command is for you, O priests, if you do not listen and if you do not take it to heart to give honor to my name, says the Lord of hosts, then I will send the curse upon you and I will curse your blessings. And indeed, I have cursed them already because you are not taking it to heart. Behold, I'm going to rebuke your offspring and I will spread refuge on your face, etc., etc., etc. Verse 4 says, then you will know that I have sent this commandment to you, that my covenant may continue with Levi, says the Lord of hosts. And so he points out that the priests were supposed to be individuals who knew the Lord. They're supposed to be individuals who demonstrated the Lord, who acted on behalf of on how the Lord would act. And yet they didn't. Eli's sons were worthless. That they were wicked, worthless men. And so he's pointing that out for us here. And it says, and so he's going to give us a couple of examples of how they were worthless. Verse 13 says, and the custom of the priest with the people, when a man was offering a sacrifice and the priest's servant would come while the meat was boiling, okay, while the meat was boiling with a three-pronged fork in his hand. Then he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and all that the fork brought up, the priest would take for himself. Thus, they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came. To all who came. So the priests were allowed to have a certain portion of the sacrifices. And apparently, during this time, it was a custom for them to boil it and for the priest to put in a little hook kind of thing, and whatever came out of it was kind of what they would receive. And so it was kind of like they're allowing the Lord, you might say, to determine for them what they're going to get when they eat, but they would boil it. And I'm not sure exactly where that idea of boiling came from, because I don't have any reference to that that we know of that I can find or that I can remember off the top of my head. But that was their custom, and so that's what they would do. Now, in verse 15, it says also. Before they burned the fat, the priest servant would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, give the priest meat for roasting, as he will not take boiled meat from you, only raw. And so the Eli's sons would come, and rather than them doing what was customary and normal for the priest to do during that time, they wanted to be treated special. They wanted to be treated differently. And part of that special different treatment was that they wanted their meat so they could roast it. So they wanted their meat raw, and so they didn't want to have their meat boiled first and then given to them, which was the custom. And so here you see arrogant individuals who, because of their position, think that they deserve more than other people, and so therefore you have them doing the very same thing that Peninnah was doing to Hannah, and that is that they would demand of them that they give them roasted meat or raw meat instead of what was usually customary. And so it says, give the priest meat for roasting, as he will not take boiled meat for you, from you, only raw. Now, notice that it says, give the priest, not priests, give the priest meat for roasting. So apparently they would use their dad as a authority for what they were doing. It doesn't say give us meat. It says give the priest meat for roasting. And notice it says as he will not take boiled meat. And this is important when we get ready to consider Eli's part in what's going on. But that they would use his name or his authority for doing this. They would use the name of the high priest as the high priest says this is what you're going to do, so therefore you need to do it. Now, verse 16 says, if the man said to him, they must surely burn the fat first and then take as much as you desire, then he would say, no, but you shall give it to me now, and if not, I will take it by force. Now, notice that the people would be willing to comply, but they said, okay, we'll give you the raw meat, but we first have to burn the fat. The Lord pointed out that the fat belongs to him. He's the one who gets the fat. In Leviticus 3:16, it says, the priest shall offer them up in smoke on the altar as food, an offering by fire for a soothing aroma to a soothing aroma. All fat is the Lord's. And so the Lord was to get the fat. And that's also true of all of it. In Leviticus 7, verse 23, of all the sacrifices, he says, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, you shall not eat any fat from any ox, a sheep, or goat. Also the fat of an animal which dies, and the fat of an animal torn by beasts may be put to any other use, but you must certainly not eat it. Whoever eats the fat of an animal from which an offering by fire is offered to the Lord, even that person who eats shall be cut off from the people. And so the law pointed out that the law pointed out that the fat belonged to God, and therefore all the fat belonged to God. Even the priests weren't allowed to eat the fat. But as these individuals are arrogant, and as these individuals don't know the Lord, therefore they're going to eat the fat. The fat represented the best, and so they're going to eat the best of it. And so they would say they must surely burn the fat first and then take as much as they desire. Then he, the priest, would say, no, but you shall give it to me now, and if not, I will take it by force. So they actually forced the people to do it, or else they would punish the people or hurt the people. And so that's certainly an abuse of their power that they had. And that's certainly something that goes against what God would expect or want of his people. And even today, there are individuals who abuse their power, if they're elders or if they're preachers or if they hold some position in the church that many times you can't even find in the scriptures, that those individuals abuse their power. I told you that I have known of preachers who have, for example, credit cards or church credit cards, and they use the credit card for their own personal interests, and they use the money for their own personal interests, instead of understanding that money belongs to the Lord and is to be used for the saints and for the work of God. And so ministers need to be satisfied with the funds that with their salary or their pay that they get, and recognize that all the other money that's collected belongs to God, and that the ministers don't have the right just to use the money any way they see fit. But I'm sure you all know of individuals who've done that. Some of them have even gone to jail because of the major abuse of such ideas. But Paul, when he collected funds, he would make sure that nobody would accuse him of misappropriating funds, and so he wouldn't even carry the funds himself. He would have the people who were sending the funds to send an individual with him in order for them to take the funds to wherever the needs were being met. And that was done more from the standpoint of keeping Paul clear of any accusations of being greedy or of money that's delivered. And so these sons of Eli, however, were pretty rotten guys. They were given a position or a job which was quite important and quite respectable, and yet they were abusing it. And so that's why it says in verse 17, thus the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for the men despised the offering of the Lord. Now, there you go. They despised the offering of the Lord. And how do you despise the offering of the Lord? Well, you despise the offering of the Lord by thinking it's common or it's ordinary or that it's not the Lord. In Malachi chapter 2 and verse 8, he says, but as for you, you have turned aside from the way. You have caused many to stumble by the instruction. You have corrupted the covenant of Levi, says the Lord of hosts. Malachi 2:13 says, this is another thing you do. You cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping and with groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. And the reason that he doesn't accept it favorably from them in this context is because they were profaning the Lord's table. They were individuals in Malachi who did not regard the table of the Lord as something important. Matter of fact, if we turn there real quick and you look at chapter 1 of the book of Malachi, which, by the way, is the last book of the Old Testament, it says in verse 6, it says, a son honors his father and a priest his master. Then if I am a father, where is my honor? And if I am a master, where is my respect, says the Lord of hosts to you, O priests who despise my name. But you say, how have we despised your name? You are presenting defiled food upon my altar. But if you say, how have we defiled you? In that you say the table of the Lord is contemptible, the table of the Lord is to be despised. But when you present the blind for sacrifice, is it not evil? And when you present the lame and the sick, is it not evil? Why not offer it to your governor? Would he be pleased with you, or would he receive you kindly, says the Lord of hosts? But now will you not entreat God's favor that he may be gracious to us? And so he points out that in Malachi, that they were having, the priests were also having problems with the idea of the table of the Lord, and they despised it. They took it lightly. I'd suggest to you that that's one of the reasons why in the Old Testament that it says that, when it comes to a tithe and the firstborn belonged to God. And it says that if you ever wanted to redeem the firstborn, that you had to not only return the firstborn, but you also had to give a fifth of it. And the reason for that is to recognize that's special. You might just look at it as being a calf or a sheep or a goat or something. But God says it's my goat, it's my sheep, it's my cow, and therefore it's to be treated holy. And so anything that belongs to God is to be treated holy. And by the way, even though he's mentioning the priests here, we need to understand that we are all priests. Every single one of us who's a Christian is a priest, and therefore there are things that belong to God that we're not to despise or defile. And we're supposed to recognize that God's the one who blesses us. But these young men were sinning very greatly, for they despised the offering of the Lord. Now, the contrast of that is Samuel, verse 18. It says, now Samuel was ministering before the Lord as a boy wearing a linen ephod. And so it's interesting that he mentions his linen ephod, because the linen ephod was that garment that was given to priests. It was that garment that priests were supposed to wear. And so he's the one who had it. And if you look, in order for you to understand that better, in 1 Samuel 22 and verse 18, where, let me just read it for you. Verse 18 says, then the king said to Doeg, you turn around and attack the priests. And Doeg, the Edomite, turned around and attacked the priests, and he killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. So the linen ephod was to be used by the priests, and here we see Samuel wearing a linen ephod. Now, notice that it says in the New American Standard, it adds the word as a boy wearing a linen ephod. So in other words, Samuel was doing what the sons of Eli weren't doing, and that is that he was ministering to the Lord, and he was offering the Lord what was due the Lord, because he knew who he was. Now, verse 19 says, and his mother would make him a little robe and bring it to him from year to year when she would come up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. So whenever Hannah would come up every year, she would make him some. So she remembered him, and she recognized that though he was out of her sight, that he was still her child, and she therefore would honor him with a little robe that she would make for him every year, because no doubt every year he got bigger and bigger, and so she would bring him clothes to wear as he grew, and so therefore she was still involved in his life, but not on a daily basis, at least not in being able to see him and minister to him daily, but she remembered him in her activities. And then it says in verse 20, and then Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife and say, may the Lord give you children from this woman in place of the one she dedicated to the Lord. And they went home to their own house. So Eli asked God to bless Hannah with more children. And so it says in verse 7, and the Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters, and the boy Samuel grew before the Lord. And so we notice that God blessed Hannah and gave her more children, gave her 5 more children, so she had 6 in all, and blessed her with children. And so not only did Elkanah love her more than Peninnah, but also blessed her with children. And so Peninnah lost her position, you might say, even though she would still be considered a wife of Elkanah. And so we notice that that's going on here. Let me check the time here. Okay. So let's take a look at this next section. I think we have time to cover it. And it says, now Eli was very old, and he heard all that his sons were doing to all Israel, and how they lay with the women who served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. He said to them, why do you do such things, the evil things that I hear from all these people? No, my sons, for the report is not good, which I hear the Lord's people circulating. If one man sins against another, God will mediate for him. But if a man sins against the Lord, who can intercede for him? But they would not listen to the voice of their father, for the Lord desired to put them to death. Now the boy Samuel was growing in stature and in favor, both with the Lord and with men. So here you're going to have the contrast again between Eli and Samuel. You're also going to have a contrast, I would suggest to you, about the difference between the way Samuel was raised and the way Eli's sons were raised. And this is an example that all of us parents need to recognize and understand. In verse 22, it says, now Eli was very old, and he heard all that his sons were doing to Israel, and how they lay with the women who served at the doorway of the tent of meeting. So not only were they taking their food by force and eating raw meat that hadn't even had the fat burned off of it, they were actually sleeping with the ladies who would come and offer service at the doorway of the tent of meeting. And so therefore, they were committing fornication, and not only that, but they were committing fornication with their sisters, with their spiritual sisters, and were defiling them. And so they were very wicked individuals. They did not know the Lord. They didn't know anything about the Lord, as you can tell from everything that they're doing. That they didn't understand the idea of holiness and the idea of separation, and they didn't understand any of that stuff. And so Eli was old. Now notice that it says Eli heard what his sons were doing. So it's not like these things were being done in the corner or in secret. How in the world can you do this in secret? People are going to find out. And so Eli found out. And he says in verse 23, and he said to them, why do you do such things, the evil things that I hear from all these people? And notice he says that he heard these things from the people. And so he knew that it was true, because it was more than just one person. It's not like one person just had something against his sons and came and told Eli. Notice that he says, I hear from these people. So he doesn't even say from a couple of people. He says from these people. So everybody knew what they were doing. Everybody knew what kind of priests they were. And yet Eli didn't really do much about it. Verse 24 says, no, my sons, for the report is not good which I hear of the Lord's people circulating. And so he says, what I'm hearing isn't good. Your reputation isn't good. Ministers need to, well, actually all Christians, but especially ministers, need to keep their reputations intact. So they need to make sure and do things that are not going to bring or mar their reputation. Now, I don't believe that ministers are more, need to be more holy or more spiritual than just a regular Christian. But I do believe that because they are in the forefront, especially if they're elders or deacons, especially if they're in the forefront, that they need to make sure and be sterling examples of proper conduct. And therefore what they do, where they go, what they say should be considered by them so that they keep their reputation intact. And Paul often mentions in his writings that he has lived in a clear conscience before God and men. And so that's what we need to do. And so just because something is lawful for us to do doesn't mean that it might be that it's the best thing for us to do when you consider your reputation. So these guys had a bad reputation, and it was, by the way, the reputation they had was true. It was a bad reputation because they were bad individuals. And he points out that if one sins against another man, God will mediate for him. In other words, if I sin against my brother, then God can help us. But if I sin against God, who is there to help me? And that's what he's pointing out here. Now, verse 25 in the middle says, but they would not listen to the voice of their father, for the Lord desired to put them to death. Now, I don't believe that when it says, for the Lord desired to put them to death, that the Lord, from the time they were born, desired to put them to death. I don't believe that's what's under consideration. And so God didn't allow them to listen. I believe what's under consideration is he says that as Eli heard about this and he tried to correct them and they refused, that because of that, then he wanted to put them to death. Because that's what the Bible taught. The Bible taught that if you had rebellious sons, that you were to take them before the elders and you were to tell them what happened or tell them what they were doing, and then they were to be stoned. And so they were to be put to death. And so the idea here, but they would not listen to the voice of the Lord, for the Lord desired to put them to death, is the idea that the Lord puts to death these kind of people who don't do these things. Now, the other thing I want you to notice is that when it says, but they would not listen to the voice of Eli, their father, apparently Eli didn't do anything else. Eli just talked to them. Maybe Eli, sometimes you have parents that are yellers and they just yell at their kids. But there's never any consequences to their action. And that's what you see going on here. You don't see any consequences to the activity of what these young men are doing. You don't hear them being punished. You don't hear them being removed from office. You don't hear of any consequences that they're bearing. And I would suggest to you that that's kind of our culture today when it comes to some children and the way some parents raise their children. They raise their children without any consequences. When the child is young, they move everything in the house so that the child won't get into it and break it, instead of teaching the child to discipline themselves and to not touch things, because the world is not going to rearrange itself for your children. We're going to have to understand that our children live in a world that has certain rules and certain guidelines, and we can't expect the world to change just because of them and because they don't like something or they're not accustomed to it. Now, don't misunderstand me. But when I say that, I'm not talking about if children have special problems or special needs. Certainly those need to be taken care of. But I'm just talking about the average normal child, that we are in our culture minimizing the consequences of their activity by not allowing them to do certain things. You can't play dodgeball anymore in school because you get hit with a dodgeball and somebody might get hurt. And certainly that's possible. But one of the other things it teaches you is to get out of the way of danger. It certainly teaches you to pay attention and to watch what's going on so that you can avoid the consequences of danger. And it does it in a rather non-threatening and non-hurtful way. We might get humiliated when we get hit, but I'd much rather have you humiliated with a dodgeball than I would with you getting humiliated because some guy shot you because you overstepped your boundaries, or you didn't do what you were supposed to do, or you robbed a bank because you decided that you wanted money and they should just give it to you. And so what you have here is you have Eli, who doesn't actually render any consequences to their activity. And that's why if Eli wasn't going to do that, then the Lord was going to do that. The Lord was going to take care of the consequences that needed to be given. And I would suggest to you that the Lord today has consequences to his rules. I mean, if you trip, you're going to fall and hit yourself. And that's because God has a rule or a law about gravity. And if you think you can defy gravity, or that you're special and you're never going to fall, then you misunderstand God's laws and you misunderstand the world in which we live in. And there are consequences. Now, we certainly need to keep our children away from immediate danger and danger that we know will happen to them. But we also need to understand that there are natural consequences that build their character and help them in understanding how life is. And so it says, but they wouldn't listen to the voice of their father, and he didn't do anything else. So the Lord was going to take care of the consequences of their activity. And by the way, you don't want the Lord taking care of the consequences of your activity. You would much rather want you to take care of the consequences of your child's activity rather than the Lord. Because as you can notice here, the Lord's taking care of consequences can be quite severe at times, but yet he's always just. Now, verse 26 says, now the boy Samuel was growing in stature and in favor both with the Lord and with men. So you notice the difference. Eli's sons did not know the Lord. Eli's sons had a bad reputation among the people. Eli's sons weren't doing what they were supposed to do. They were lying with the women. But now Samuel, he was growing in stature, so he was getting older and taller and bigger, and in favor both with the Lord and with men. And so God was pleased with Eli, and God was pleased with Samuel, and so men were pleased with Samuel. And so you see the difference between the activity of Samuel and the activity of Eli's sons. And so that's pretty much as we can cover now. I want to cover the rest of this next week, because I want to spend some time in that. And by the way, most of our chapters in the book of Samuel won't be covered in such extent, to such detail. There'll be some that we'll just skim over, but I want to cover these first ones so we understand what's going on here. And so I'm glad you're here, glad you came. Pray the Lord blesses you for having been here, and pray that he continues to watch over you and take care of you. I pray God's richest blessings on you.